Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book. This is a show that breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how they're played. I'm your host, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max, and with us behind the scenes working away is our producer, Jay, as always. Today's episode is a look into the wide variety of weapons, armor, and equipment your characters will find and use in their adventures and across their many battles.
Yeah, so maybe we should define our concepts. So, like, what are we talking about exactly?
In a big way, equipment is something that you graft onto yourself. It is not necessarily intrinsic to a character, but it is, equipment is equipable.
Mm-hmm. Like, what are your feelings as far as, like, how you've seen this handled in role-playing games to begin with?
My first thought is a lot of times equipment is just these modifiers that don't themselves bring anything more than a way to extend something you're already doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I'm already striking, so I'm going to strike with this additional consideration. But it doesn't really change how you strike or why you strike or any of that at all. It's just like a factor to consider beyond your basic strike itself. So it's like, to answer your question, it's like, I don't think a lot of games do enough.
Yeah, that's my opinion. I honestly am, and this isn't just coming off of our last episode, which I described as an equipment-based game. That would be Metamorphosis Alpha. But also, I just tend to like games that put equipment, I wouldn't say front and center, but on equal footing with character ability. And there are some games that do that. Call of Cthulhu tends to have more interesting weapons. An even better example is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
Yeah.
Second and fourth especially. There's a few other ones where if it's not, I don't think I've ever seen one that's equipment forward per se, like where equipment, well, I guess Metamorphosis Alpha is the one where I'm like, oh, well, it's not specifically saying that by default, that's the most important thing in the game.
Yes.
But at least on the same footing as abilities, skills, powers, I feel like equipment should matter something. It does depend on the kind of game, but I'm sick to death of games that just have it weighs this much and it does this much damage and it has this range. And basically all weapons are interchangeable. I mean, there are rules light systems where I think that's fine, but that's because that's the style of system that it is.
Right.
But there's some games where it's like, this feels like it should be more sophisticated. Why is a battle axe, a D8, and a longsword the same thing? And there's very little distinction between them aside from the fact that I happen to be holding this and not that. Like aesthetics.
And the whole comment on like, oh, and they also will tell you their weight. How often do players and game masters just completely ignore that because it doesn't matter?
Well, we'll get into tracking weight and consumables for sure.
Because that's something to me that, like, I like when a game kind of has like, instead of giving me this abstract idea of like, you can hold 57 pounds. So as long as your backpack adds up to 56 pounds, you're good. Like, I don't like that. I like when there's sort of more like you're working with slots or like spaces that you can fill, so to speak. And that's what you have to manage because it's not like it's this like perfectly flexible volumetric space that you can like, okay, I've got everything in there because it only was 56 pounds and I'm good to go. I like I'm allowed to have maybe like one or two weapons and one of them can be a ranged weapon. And beyond that, I kind of need to think about storing stuff,
Yeah. Well, especially for like rules light stuff, things like Troika or Knave, the idea of slots, does Blades in the Dark do that as well?
I don't know that well enough to know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, there's a few in that sort of vein that use a slot system. And some of them do some really clever stuff, like if you have, I don't remember which game this is, but if you had like 12 slots and you didn't have the item like readily equipped, like, you have a sword and a sheath on your belt, you actually have to roll 2d6 to see if you get the right item.
Oh, cool. I like that. That's fun. I don't want everything to be Diablo 1, with like the grid interface or like a weird Resident Evil trying to like go through your inventory and it's a nightmare by itself. I'm not trying to describe an experience like that.
Sure.
But what I want when it comes to equipment is you to feel like you're holding a thing, something beyond like, like I don't want to be T-1000 and my arm just turns into a metal sword. And now that's me. That's what I have now. I want there to have a feeling as much as a role-playing game can impart, of course, but the feeling of having an object that I can have and lose. And that's something that I think a lot of GMs get really shy about is taking away items, because you don't really want to like mess with something that someone worked hard to get their hands on. But at the same time, there's so much drama to be had from like having a sword and losing a sword and now being disarmed. And there's a lot to play with there. But there's that kind of like game concept of like, oh, you always have your sword on you. Even if I take it away, it's magically magnetized to your back and you're going to have it.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of that. And it might have something to do with the style of play that I enjoy. But I like when a situation makes a player have to think in a way other than the way they would normally.
Yes.
And sometimes that involves it, like that can go as far as to be like dramatic. Like that can give motivation. Like, oh, you were thrown in prison. You had your weapons taken from. Well, now you have an immediate objective aside from getting out, which is getting your stuff.
Yeah.
Right. I'm a big proponent of outcomes that give cause.
Yeah.
So this is one of the reasons why I actually like tracking provisions and ammunition, because at some point they will give cause for me to be concerned or change my tactics. I know a lot of people aren't a huge fan of that. I'm also totally happy to use other types of ways of creating those outcomes that aren't necessarily so meticulous. But I think it's important to have those things because I don't want to feel entirely like I'm at the whim of the GM. And as a GM, I don't want to feel entirely responsible for everything that happens. I want to be surprised.
Yeah.
I want to see things come up that I'm not expecting. I'm not hands off, and I will try to move things toward the most interesting outcome. But I want things to have a kind of economy of drama.
Oh, I like that.
I'm not going to say I don't like fiat decisions because they're expedient. They can be dramatic. They can be interpreted in such a way where they feel like they fit really well.
Right.
But I always like this idea that the GM is actually two decision makers instead of one. One decision maker is their own judgment, and the second one is random outcome. And some of that is on the player side because obviously the player's rolling dice. But there's this invisible third player at the table that is really interesting to engage with and let be engaged with. And I think equipment is a really, really cool place where you have something that can exist and then it can break, it can be taken from you, you can find a better one, you can improvise one, and that gets the real creativity. So like, maybe we should get into some of the specific like attributes that are common to a lot of equipment in games.
These would be like important bullet points that you can use to help understand, like, what are some of the factors that go into having equipment, getting equipment, and what it means. And a lot of these will at first apply more to a role-playing game, but we'll also throw in references to weapons and armor and equipment and how that plugs into war games too. But for first, something that's key to equipment is both cost and availability. That will define your character's exposure to that equipment. We're so used to starting campaigns, right? Not to just completely diverge from our topic already, but like we're so used to starting over again and getting the friends together or getting the journal book out for your solo campaign or whatever. And we're used to that process of beginning so many times because so many reasons to restart come up. We lost our place, the group changed, had to get a new game because a new edition came out and we were excited, whatever it was. But like, you think about the cost and availability of these items and it's like, we're so familiar with short swords, but we never get to use like the really cool, like falchion. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah.
There's a certain funniness to that, right? That there's these like things that you almost take for granted about an item, like its cost and availability, like whatever, it's 15 gold and it's a availability type R or whatever would be appropriate for your game, right? But it's funny that those can really influence a weapon as much as its damage, just in the way that you do or do not see it even. Like, why would you take a D4 dagger when you could take a D6 short sword? You know what I mean? If they're both going to be like class compatible to you.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same thing with the cost and availability. And why would you take something or end up with something that is just so hard to get to you, especially if it's has equivalent other items, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're going to have all those choices, in my opinion, they should matter.
Yeah.
And things like the cost should be one reflective aspect of that decision. So presumably, at least in the economics of the world that we live in today, generally something better made or less available is more expensive.
Right.
And that may or may not be of use to you at any time. You might get by with something cheap, but it almost makes that a goal. Like, I can't think of any other attribute of a character that so easily becomes a kind of goal when it's not presented to you. Because you tend to think of, say, level ups and abilities and skill improvements as something that's kind of between games when you have a chance to apply those things, but they're intrinsic. But one thing that's unique about equipment is that it makes you think about those things in game. Like, it's one of the few mechanical things that exists in the world that is also a mechanic of the game. And that's why I find it's kind of discrediting when it's dumbed down.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, it doesn't matter, I'll just grab that axe. And it's like, well, for expedience sake, yeah, that's probably helpful. But this is like one of the more interesting mechanical aspects of the game that you engage with during play rather than between play.
And it's not like some ephemeral stat. It's like a real tangible thing that your character is interacting with. It's not like, oh, I have 18 intelligence because I'm a genius. It's like, no, it's an axe and you're holding it. And what are the properties of it that influence its behavior?
Yeah, and you can role play with your equipment. You can be, I don't want to use you're playing Delta Green, you're going nuts, and then you're talking to your rifle like it's your friend.
Yeah.
Right? But like that's a unique thing because it's a separate object from you in the world, and then your character has a relationship to it. I mean, I guess you could sit there and mutter about how good you are at picking locks to yourself while in a stressful situation. But those things are the thing I find interesting. Attributes and skills in the course of role-playing are kind of invisible, or they should be invisible to your character. Like, you obviously know I'm pretty good at this, but like anybody in real life, you numerically can see how good you are at it, but you don't really know in character term. You just say, I've picked a lock before. I know how locks work. I feel reasonably confident that most of the locks I've picked correctly, and which is to say they open.
Well,
there might be other qualities, like I didn't leave any trace that I had opened it. I didn't break it.
Well, it's like, unless you're an NBA player, you don't have stats about every aspect of your life. You know what I mean? So it's
Sure.
like to put the emphasis so much on something that is so abstract when there's something so tangible right there, literally in the hands of your character, that you're going to minimize and make basically an empty choice. That just is such a missed opportunity.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of neat qualities that some games have included, obviously crunchier games, and I'm a crunchy gamer, so obviously I appreciate those things. It's not that I'm not interested in the narrative quality of games, but I think that some of those mechanical details actually make the story more interesting by adding a non-dictative element to it. It creates a consequences effectively. Some of these things are like quality and durability. So that's something that like your character can then apply a evaluation or an appraise check and be like, well, do I know enough about good metallurgy to know if this sword is a decent sword? And the sword will have a quality, and then that can go into bartering. That's why I always found the barter skill as a standalone skill to be kind of weird, because there's a lot of different things going in. I see it more like a series of skills or actions.
Yeah, like barter shouldn't be a singular verb that just like, oh, I barter you. You know what I mean? It should be like I choose a related skill that I can use in my barter action to you. You know, like
Yeah.
It's like same thing with appraise. It's like, oh, I'm good at looking at everything. You know, like, oh, I know the value of everything. I'm good at appraise. Like, it's just I like in the Star Wars role playing game by Fantasy Flight Games or Edge Studios, or if that even exists anymore. How that works is you can like roll your blaster skill to know the marks on the wall. You're like, oh,
Right.
that was from one of these rifles. Like, you know what I mean? But you're rolling your weapon skill, but you're rolling it out of combat. And
alternate application. Yeah.
I love that.
For sure.
I think that's super cool.
And I think that should go more into barter. Like, your skill with the weapon isn't just my ability to accurately point that weapon and shoot, but it's my overall familiarity with it. And it should be applied to repairing the weapon, as you say, identifying the use of that weapon, and also bartering or appraising the quality of it.
Yeah, 100%.
As opposed to these abstracted, like, I'm good at appraise. Appraising what? There's so many things that you could have a quantitative or qualitative opinion on. Why would one skill cover all of those things?
Yeah.
And you shouldn't need a separate skill because it really comes down to your knowledge of whatever the topic at hand is.
Yeah, I agree.
So that's a good example of like how skills and equipment interact with each other. Then there's another area that skills and equipment interact with each other is crafting or modifying something.
Right. That's like making, well, anything from making your own equipment to taking an existing piece of equipment, putting something fancy on it.
Yeah, and some games that might be more important than others. Like in a post-apocalyptic survival game, crafting and modifying equipment could be a big component of the game.
Yes.
But in a fantasy dungeon crawler, just having a cellar with an item list is probably sufficient.
Unless you really want to go like in the forge route, you know what I'm saying? There's not a lot of crafting in your average fantasy game, right? But I think the attitudes of a lot of gamers, just through their changing exposure to more popular video games, has made something like crafting more desirable in a tabletop game. Because there are just so many of these crafting style video games, right? Where you're out building a hut, whether it's like Valhalla or Ark or all these different games. They're really neat and they're fun to play. But sometimes what works on a computer game just does not translate. And I feel like the resourciness of crafting, where it's like, do you have 16 wolf pelts and 4 of these? Like,
oh, sure.
I feel like you need to look at it differently. You can still craft in a tabletop game, but this like shopping list of items, I don't feel like is the solution.
Oh, you mean the requirements to make
exactly. Right?
Like we need this. I mean, I think it's something that shouldn't be too hard to figure out what is a reasonable, like, there's enough information out there. You can look up how much metal and wood and leather it would take to make a sword.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's more work than some people want to put in, but I often find crafting is a downtime activity. So you probably have the time.
Oh, yeah.
You know, honestly, we need to do an episode about downtime because there are so many like nuanced things where it's like, well, I don't want to have all these mechanics and blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, but you're not using them while you're on an adventure. It's like the whole game is not necessarily in play.
Yeah.
This is sort of some of my argument about like even weapon stuff in like weapons in games. It's like, oh, well, I don't want super complex weaponry. And I'm like, it only comes into play in combat.
Yeah.
Chill. You know, like people feel like, oh my God, there's all these rules I have to worry about. And I'm like, only when they're applicable.
Yeah, it's true.
Right?
I will qualify that by saying you're a BattleTech fan, but I will also say...
Fine. All right. I've been outed.
We both are, though. But
yeah, I know. And it's classic.
Totally.
As well. I don't go in for this Alpha Strike thing. I mean, it's fine.
But you need the
I won't
real
get into
deal
that.
though. Like I'm here for the real sauce.
Yeah. So that should give people an indication of what kind of games I like playing.
But I mean, like, I do know what you mean though, in that, like, having more dense or bespoke combat rules around your equipment and items doesn't necessarily slow the game down. It makes that part of the game a different experience, perhaps more enriched or slower, depending how you may or may not look at it. But it's not like it's not like it's a zero-sum equation of time, right? And I make one change and it's like, well, this game's slow now. You know what I mean?
Even when I was playing D&D like 3.5, if there was something that I wanted to put in, I would look it up when I had the time to put it in. And it didn't feel like it was missing somehow if I hadn't already put it in. So I didn't have to like create a laundry list of special rules or certain items or things like that. I would just go find that thing and be like, oh, okay, that's cool. Make a note of that and then pass it on to the player or apply it as I thought needed.
Yeah.
The other thing that gets me about how equipment is treated, and this goes back to the idea that it's just a stat line. This is especially true of weapons, in my opinion, and I like watching people who do weapon demonstrations and various other things, like gun demonstrations and those sorts of, watching that stuff on YouTube, especially if they explain, they come from a tool point of view.
Okay.
I'll explain that further. Weapons are not necessarily this thing trumps that thing because this does more damage. Usually, the way a weapon operates in real life is that it's designed to solve a particular problem.
Right.
Right?
Totally.
My problem with a lot of RPGs is that everything's a hammer.
100%. Like, to riff on your point, think of a fencing sword, like a rapier. That's just a worse sword. But in fact, there's a super specific reason and a lot of defensive advantage to using that within an appropriate context, right?
Yeah.
But it's just often presented as like, oh, it's a light sword, sure, but it's just an inferior damage weapon. It doesn't take into account the ways that it can, like, really give you a defensive posture that's incredibly hard to breach.
Yeah, well, so let's use a rapier as an example in this case. So from a tactical point of view, you're always able to main a line of defense because it's a thrusting weapon with a fair bit of reach.
Yep.
Right? So you don't have to pull back to swing, which leaves you open. Now, how that's interpreted in rules can vary. Another thing is that in the right hands, it can be quite an accurate weapon. So it can slip under a helmet and get someone in the neck.
Yes.
Whereas a swing is relying more on the focused force of the weight on the weapon, provided with an edge. But when you hit somebody with a sword, you're cutting them, but as much as you're cutting them, you're also trying to like knock them off balance.
Yeah, there's a transference of weight that you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And like with a rapier, it's different. Like with a rapier, it's so much more precise. Like, I'm a nerd, so when I did athletic stuff, oh yeah, it was fencing for sure. So it was super fun.
Yeah,
but it's you learn that like you're using different muscle groups than you might anticipate for a quote sword fight. And I did some of this Zweihander, like two-handed stuff a little bit, and that's just like wailing on each other with baseball bats that are sharp, right? It's crazy. But with the rapier, you're right. Like I got hit right on the gorget, like right on the neckline, and it was a perfect strike. And it was just like, well, that's how you lose a sword fight, Pretty
much, yeah. And so you have those qualities. So like you don't even they're both swords technically, but you use them in completely different ways. I mean, even a sword compared to an axe is different.
Yeah, for sure.
Like for instance, you could parry with both weapons, but you'd probably want to parry with the sword.
Yes.
Because the axe is so end heavy, right? That there would be an extreme amount of effort to try and block. Also, a point, and that may be an exaggeration between those two things. It's important to note that actual battle axes are much smaller and lighter than like like a felling axe for like cutting trees down.
Yeah.
Which is another thing that you see in like a lot of, especially fantasy art.
Yes, 100%. They get axes wrong a lot.
Yeah, they're like an inch thick and like what?
The warhead is bigger than a human
Okay.
head, and you're like, yeah, battle. Yep. Well, the other thing too that always comes to my mind, because I've done some fencing, so you hit your fingers a lot if you're not careful. So trying to parry with an axe is just like, say goodbye to your fingers. You're just going to get them all chopped off, and that's going to be bad.
Oh yeah, like your reflexive hand-eye coordination better be real good.
Yeah, because you're hitting a fast target with a small target, and you're going to need to do that quick.
Yeah, and an unbalanced tool at that.
Right.
So yeah, that's my point. Is that like there are these things about those weapons where it's not just a series of bigger or smaller hammers. They're different tools that apply to different, like another good example, again, in the sword category. We'll move on to firearms at some point when we get there, but we're talking fantasy weapons, probably because people will relate those to their own games. But two-handed swords, especially really long two-handed swords like claymores, yeah, they're a heavy piece of metal that you can swing and you can apply the force and pressure of both arms in doing it. Of course, you do also need that strength to lift it as well. But they're not really designed for a casual fight. A duel, maybe. But they're mainly designed for breaking pike lines.
Yeah, they have a very specific, tactical role.
Yeah, and that or dueling. So both people have the same weapon or comparable, or at least you only have to focus on one target.
Yeah.
But in a skirmish or a bar fight, even many of the tactics that apply to two-handed swords in a battlefield, at some point when you get close enough into that pike line, you just drop the sword and you pull out something smaller like a battle axe, which is more like a hatchet, or a short sword or a falchion or something like that. And then you are now in a proximity where you can start going to town without having to wield this cumbersome thing that's mainly for pushing poles out of the way.
And you really don't want to telegraph anything you do. So the bigger, heavier thing you have, the more information you're giving to your opponent. And I've seen some of the HEMA fighting stuff, and some of the two-handed fighting is you use that sword not in big, broad, sweeping strokes, but it's the same way you would contain a pike by sweeping it and branching them. You can do that as a wrestling technique where you're grabbing someone and bracing them in your grip with a two-handed blade, and you're just sort of holding your own blade in a way, but it is to constrain someone. And that is seemingly counterintuitive to the way that weapon is depicted in most fantasy fighting.
Generally, yeah. In many ways, a two-handed sword is kind of a stopgap between a polearm and a one-handed sword.
That's so true. And polearms get such weird treatment in role-playing games.
Oh my God. There's the infamous list of polearms that Gary Gygax, so clearly he had opinions there.
Yeah, 100%. That is such a classic. That's a classic gag. How many polearms can you fit into your role-playing game, and how similar can you make all of them? To the point that there's no reason that you did that.
Yeah.
And the spear is probably, before the introduction of firearms, the core weapon.
Yeah.
It's not as dramatic or as exciting as a sword. It's not as multi-purposed as an axe, but you don't need a ton of training to use a spear. They don't require a ton of materials to make relative to a sword or even an axe. And
it's a dagger on a stick, basically.
It's a dagger on a stick, man. And if you get enough of them together, you can really control land. You can control places. What happens if you just point 300 sharp sticks at a guy? It's well, you can't really walk that way now. So those guys have that. Unless you have a plan to get those 300 sticks out of your way, you're not going over there. So it's interesting that polearms kind of get misinterpreted as these awkward two-handed weapons that people kind of attribute weird billhook qualities to nearly all of them, as if that's the point of them all, is to have these weird, not weird, I guess, but very specific tactical nuances, when in fact, the spear is kind of the core thing that you would want to use throughout the most of history as a melee weapon.
I mean, if we want to go further than that, there's also like qualities about range weapons.
Oh, good point.
That are also sort of, they fall into that category where like this would work in this way and it wouldn't necessarily work in that way. And there's a reason that we use, like, one good distinction between some weapons are what are the qualities that make a crossbow and a drawn bow different?
Right.
And a lot of them have it so that the crossbow just does more damage and doesn't have quite the range. And that is sort of true to an extent. But there's so many qualities about the two where it's like, well, this one is good at these things and this one is good at... So like, if you wanted to be ready to shoot somebody in an instant, a crossbow is a much better weapon because all of that force is held by the mechanism of the crossbow. Whereas on a drawn bow, you have to hold it like that. And
yes.
Having fired bows before, you don't want to hold that thing back longer than you have to. You're pretty much pulling it in position, taking aim, and letting go. Like loosing it, and that's it. And hopefully you hit your target. You don't want to stand there holding it. You know, and that's a thing in movies that's where I'm like, wow, that guy must have superhuman stamina because they're just standing there with a drawn arrow. But yeah, there's like this sort of speed thing. I mean, that's some of the advantages that crossbows have are the same advantages that firearms have, which is pull trigger fire.
Yeah.
It's ready to at a moment. Actually, one of my favorite rules for this comes from the most recent Call of Cthulhu, where if you have a trigger firearm, usually a gun, in your hand, an initiative gets called, you can preempt initiative, but only to shoot that gun.
Oh, I know the rule. That's wild.
And that, again, that gun has to be ready in your hand. I mean, I guess if you were like a some cool like quick shooter.
What's his name? Dakota Jones or something. He's their knockoff Indiana that comes in the starter set.
Oh, sure.
Like, he can do it.
If you pass some kind of quick draw check, then okay, that might be a cool exception. But I would imagine that, again, there's another example of, sometimes they have that as like a talent or a feat, where it's like, oh, I can draw my weapon as a free action. I'm like, I feel like that's a cool allowance for dramatic purposes, but I feel like anybody with sufficient skill should be able to make a skill check on that weapon, say sidearms or pistols or however it's classified, because it's your familiarity with pulling that. There's another thing, like pistols versus rifles. What is the thing that makes a pistol different from a rifle? Well, one, with a lot less effort, I can pull it up and have it ready rather than have it presented in my arm. My turning radius with a pistol is way shorter, which is something that does not get represented super well in a lot of games, where minimal distance actually matters a lot. There's this great video, it was a police training. I think it's called Edge Weapons, or so, like police training with edge weapons. It's got hilarious overacting, and it's like the most, like, it's like a violent 80s action movie, but it's for training police with people who have knives. But one thing they point out, which I've also read in other places, is that the distance, if you're not holding your firearm on you ready to be used, the distance that can be closed for a melee attack, like a close quarters attack, is like seconds.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, it's usually in the favor of the close quarter combatant, the guy with the knife. If they can move fast enough, they actually outdo the gun, because there's only so much ability to react. And with two-handed firearms, it's actually worse, because you're having to swivel you have to swivel your whole body to fire a pistol, but there's a lot more leeway as to how much you have to turn. Whereas with a rifle, you really have to turn your body in order to shoot. I mean, you can do sort of impromptu, like hip shooting and stuff like that. But even in that case, you're at a disadvantage, because you're effectively using the firearm as a melee weapon at that point.
Well, that's actually really interesting. Like, This is something that bows get done with, or get done with bows, very wrong, in my opinion, in a lot of fantasy and even medieval historical games, is you can use a bow basically up to the point of contact. And it's like, you absolutely cannot.
No, that there's a reason that, at least in a lot of medieval battles and stuff where archers were present, those archers had either usually a falchion, which is essentially a medieval machete.
Yep.
Or they'd have some kind of like dagger or short sword or something that they could defend.
Or they'd have sharpened stakes in front of them, right? They'd have,
they'd have emplacements to keep, and also with slow loading firearms like muskets and stuff, having emplacements, redoubts with spikes or something to keep the enemy from getting 100%. Too close.
Yeah,
pikemen.
Yeah, some friendly pikemen.
The idea that range weapons are great at every range, and even within that, like as I said, a pistol has a specific use, which is a stopgap between long range and close quarters.
Yes.
Because a rifle is super effective because you have both hands steadying your aim. You have enough distance between you, and obviously, usually the caliber and the barrel length are going to give you more accuracy and range. But that doesn't mean you want to use that when somebody's running at you close enough that they could actually stab you within like a few seconds.
100%.
And that's one reason. In fact, that's why bayonets exist.
Yeah.
They are as much a offensive weapon or a defensive weapon as an offensive weapon. Because it's like, well, I'm going to be holding this thing for the majority of my combat time, and I'm going to be shooting with it. But there's always a chance someone could run at me. It'd be really nice if I could use this thing like a spear.
Yeah, it is the evolution of the spear in every regard. And what you say is exactly true. Like, the order to fix bayonets doesn't come when you're going to charge. It comes within a certain proximity of your opposition, right?
Yeah.
And that can be reactive to them coming at you, just like you say. This is a question I want to hit you with real quick here before we wrap up on weapons. In my opinion, slings and their stone ammunition is the neglected weapon of fantasy gaming. What is your thought on the neglected weapon, the weapon that doesn't get sung?
You know what? I'm actually I'm gonna join you on slings, but I'm going to make some interesting points about how slings are not well represented. So slings are kind of seen as a dump weapon.
They really are.
In a lot of fantasy games.
Oh, yeah.
And they're totally not a dump weapon. The disadvantages are not reflected in how much damage they do. They do a lot of damage, and they do very like blunt force damage. They can also be used to throw other projectiles, like explosives if you want.
Yep.
So it's like people are like, oh, well, people use slings, and then they used bows, and then they used guns, so there must be a steady linear improvement. Yes, but not in the aspect you'd probably imagine. So the main thing that sets those apart is training and placement.
Right.
For each of those, in fact. It takes a lot of practice to be good with a sling, and that practice has to be maintained. So that's first off.
Yeah.
Compared to a bow, which still requires a fair bit of skill to use and also needs to be maintained, not everybody can use them super well. I mean, anybody can, if you pick up a long piece of fabric and then you sling it, yeah, I can get the effect of throwing something out of a strip of cloth or leather or whatever. But to be accurate with it, that takes practice.
Could you get a vase 150 yards away, right? Like some of these Balearic slingers, like whang, and they could just like take the top off a vase. Like, they were amazing. And that weapon, like, there was a reason why the Romans had such big shields, Yeah. Because they had to protect against these small rocks that could whip in like a bullet.
And they get fast. Like,
oh, yeah.
Really fast. And they can cover a lot of distance. So the whole, like, they have crap range is also a thing that I'm like, what? No. Like, yeah, I grant you, like, an English longbow could shoot farther than most things.
Yes.
But, like, they always stump the range down on the sling. And I'm like, that's not right.
I know.
The other thing that sets those weapons particularly apart is placement. So think of the physical action of spinning a sling. Now, how many guys can you get close together in order to create a formation of guys doing that?
Not a lot, really. No.
Right. So slingers usually make up skirmish groups. They're usually small, spread out groups of guys that harass, essentially, from usually flanks. Not always, but that's the best use. I think that's most Bronze Age cultures, probably older than that, if they do use slings in a tactical way, it's basically as a form of harasser.
Yeah, it's to take those big blocks, which are kind of easy to hit. They're much easier than a small little individual, right? If there's like a phalanx all there, that's something you can hit.
Yeah.
And then you just get near it, try and find where the shields aren't directly square on you, and throw rocks at them real fast.
But a line of archers, well, you can pack them into a very tight formation, and then you can fire, not to mention because the way they arc.
Yes.
They're a lot less lateral, and they can actually arc down, especially with longbows. So you can actually not only have guys packed together lengthwise, but also in depth. And then you can have they still require, obviously, space. And then when you get to like muskets, well, now you've got a really sleek profile, a single trigger pull, almost no residual actions aside from reloading, which is a whole other procedure. So you can really pack in ranks of guys. To be fair, you go back to lateral firing. So the only reason to have depth is so that the line behind you is ready to fire when the other one has to reload.
Yes, the famous thin red line, for example, right, of only 2 to 3 riflemen or musketeers, pardon me.
So that's a perfect example of like using slings to kind of describe how this thing is. It's not crap. It requires a lot of skill to use, and it requires a bit of room.
It does.
Using a sling in a hallway, while technically possible, is not advantageous to the slinger at all. In fact, even using bows in corridors, while slightly better, is not optimal.
Favorite dungeon weapon is a thrown weapon, for sure. It's got to be like a spear or an axe that you can just throw, like a throwing spear in a dungeon down that corridor. It's got to be your best, like a javelin or something.
Javelin is a perfect example. It's because you are using a lot of movement, but you're using that movement in a directed way where you're moving forward, and so is the projectile, as opposed to creating like orbital movement that could bounce off the wall, or using a drawn weapon like a bow that not only has that reach, but then if you have to turn to change direction, I mean, hopefully you're not shooting at anything that close, so you really shouldn't be using a bow. But it's awkward, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of these considerations that, like, we talk so much about immersion, but then we're so willing to compromise on all of these things. You know what I mean? Just because, I don't really want to think about how a bow would work. That's kind of complicated. Nah. You know what I mean? Like,
in a certain kind of game, that's fine, right? But then you really, like, you're throwing a lot of that away. But to me, as people are like, oh, well, I don't want to think on these mechanical things because I want to focus on the story. And you're right, there is a line to be drawn there. But the mechanical things can become part of the story, right? That's the fun. It's that third heat, right?
Yeah.
That it isn't just me negotiating a plot with somebody else. There's also these, like, causal things that are working that will be surprising and dramatic to both of us. The dice are literally that. Like, you don't need dice to role play. You can just talk it out, right?
You could free Krieg your way through it, for sure you could.
Yeah, you it's basically improv at that point.
Yeah.
But we're already using an element that adds an X factor to the game. The fact that there are other mechanics that do that. And again, people only have so much RAM, and sometimes these things seem more daunting than they actually are.
True.
But I do think that they bring something into the game that has a kind of anticipation behind it. That, like, oh, wow, like I should, they're coming in close. I got to change my gear and get ready for them. And it's like, I feel smart when I do that because I'm like, oh, that'll tactically matter. The thing that I always left questioning is, does the GM know enough that my decisions will actually have an effect?
That's true. Not everyone's like a sword expert and will know, like, oh, wait a second. That's not how you parry. You know what I mean? Like,
and then the other danger that you run is if you do that and the GM who may be able to realize that it's like, oh yeah, did I just put everyone else at a disadvantage because I'm the only one who's smart and now the GM has adapted to my strategy?
Yeah.
Right? And I was like, well, I don't want that either. Like, I don't want to feel like I'm out here with a bunch of people that don't know how to be on a battlefield when their characters clearly present themselves as such. So like, these are things, this is why it always comes down to the group.
Yeah.
It's all about your group. And it's important to be upfront about like, this is the style of play. This is how we play the game. Armor. Let's move on to that.
There are two broad schools of thought on this, obviously. There is armor as a threshold to beat and defeat. So that would be your armor class. Or armor as not something that you're trying to, like you're still trying to overcome it, but it's not like a static threshold. It is instead a reductive property against your damage. So if I was to do 10 damage and you had a damage reduction, or a DR as we call it, of 3, I would only get 7 through to you. So comparing and contrasting armor class and damage reduction, you're doing the same type of thing, but you're getting there through very different means. You explained to me sort of where armor class, or I guess why armor class was decided upon in earlier times. You know what I mean? As a means of expediency.
Yeah, more or less. It was to keep things going because it was D&D. Not that D&D came up with the idea of armor class because there are war games that have similar mechanics, but because it was on a convention circuit and they were doing tournament games, it makes a lot of sense to not have your players who may never play the game have to do the subtractive math. I find DR is more realistic, but it's important to give players enough time to be familiar with that procedure when playing. So I take damage and then I minus my DR and we see what happens. I prefer DR, but I don't mind AC as a way of playing. Like if I'm just doing like a fun pulpy, like a DCC or D&D or, dungeon crawler thing, AC works fine. But if I'm doing something where I want to really feel like I'm in that situation and I'm wearing that armor, the DR, like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is a good example where you, also because it uses sectional armor, so like location-based armor.
Right, yes it does.
When you get hit, you're like, oh, that bounced off my arm and it affected, like there's a storytelling element there. It's like, it hit me in the arm, but it bounced off my greaves and I'm fine. Whereas with D&D, that's more left up to interpretation. There was a thing that we were talking about before we started recording where I was saying, if you're playing a D20 based game, you can apply a narrative procedure to your armor class.
Yes, this is interesting.
So especially with a modern D20 game. So modern D20 games have a 50-50 chance that's represented by all things being starting at 10. So it's always 10 plus other modifiers. So let's say, for instance, that our character has a dexterity bonus of 2 and an armor that gives them an AC of 2. So they have an overall AC of 14. Now, if the attacker rolled under 10, that means they whiffed it. There was no chance they were going to come close to this. If they scored on an 11 or 12, it means that the agility of the target was what moved them out of the way, right? So they sidestepped that shot. It was close enough that it was a threat, but it wasn't in that area. If they then hit on a 13 or 14, that means that it ricocheted off of the armor. And I would actually, if someone's carrying a shield, I would procedurally put the shield before the armor itself. So if you got a +1 and they ended up getting, so we imagine there's a +1 from the shield. If they scored a 13, so above the dex chance, but it wasn't 14 or 15, which would have been on the body, then it bounces off the shield. And that's a way that, like, again, these things are happening so fast, but I always like the idea that I rolled something and I can be like, oh, what other information can I glean from this based on the statistics that already exist? And very often on character sheets, it's written in that procedural order, but I don't always see people read it as such. They're just like, oh yeah, like they rolled an 8 and you're like, yeah, you sidestepped that. And I was like, actually, you didn't have to because they weren't even close to hitting you.
Well, think about a war game where it's like -1 to hit. If I need a D6 roll and I'm rolling a 4 to hit and it's a -1 to hit, so now I'm hitting you on a 5 or higher on the D6, and I roll a 4, that would have been a hit, but now it's not because of that -1 from the cover. In that instance, my shooting hits the cover specifically, right? Like that's a way to think about it in a to hit roll in a war game where the amount of the modifier is sort of like the coverage of the obstacle in a way. And even we were talking about this too, in BattleTech, like in Alpha Strike, if you hit within a certain numeric range of your target, but you still miss, you can hit the cover they're behind. So it could like do damage to a structure or something.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, even in classic BattleTech, there's not always, but there are rules for effectively crossfire, so things that are in the way of firing, and there's an order of operations based on what's closest and what's farthest away.
Yes.
Those tend to be more advanced rules, and you can go farther than that and have it overshoot. So you're not necessarily over penetrational rules, those also exist, but like if I missed my target and there's a guy behind that in a clear line, there's a chance I might hit that guy.
Yes.
That makes it more interesting because now I tactically have to be more aware of my positioning of all my pieces, because I could fire at my target, miss, and then blast my friend who's standing behind it.
Or very much the same where it's like, do I use this mech to engage in a city fight where I know if I miss, I'm going to knock down the skyscraper, and I can't do that because it's my city. You know what I mean? Like, it creates wrinkles. And I think, broadly speaking, to just pontificate in big terms, that's the best part of weapons and armor and equipment, is when it's creating these extra layers of decision points, right? Like, to tie it back down to armor and armor class and damage reduction and stuff, the penalties you take from wearing armor can be very interesting, right? They can be as bland as like a -2 to your dex, which is fine and can make sense. But I always like when there's more of like secondary penalties, like, oh, your stealth checks are bad now because you're wearing chainmail. Like, I prefer that over just, oh, a dexterity gets a little bit worse. You know what I mean? Like, it's more of a specific condition.
There's a specific kind of thing. And I guess it comes down to like, why do you wear armor and why don't you wear armor?
Yes.
And that's an interesting thing that I don't know that I've looked into super deep. I mean, the weight is an issue. And if you have, say, fatigue, like if you're playing GURPS or something like that, if you're walking around in full plate armor all the time, it's going to wear on you more than if you weren't wearing it. I mean, that's an interesting thing. It's also interesting when games have things where you can layer armor.
Oh, I like layered armor because I feel like that's a big part of how you would wear armor.
Yeah, armor tends to be composite layers of things. You don't just throw metal over your body and that's it. At the very least, you're wearing some kind of padding underneath that, because the metal that makes up armor has a certain kind of strength that's good, but with a focused fire, once it pops right in and there's nothing stopping it from that point. This is something that I think is usually demonstrated with firearms, or even some very powerful crossbows have been known to actually, like, once it goes through, it goes all the way through. But if you were wearing some meshed material underneath that, it might actually slow the arrow down enough to stop it.
That's so interesting. Like, the layering is what protects you, not the hardness of your outer layer, right?
Again, it has to do with these levels of complexity. It's really if you're thinking that way. But it's nice. I often think that sometimes role-playing games are a good way to kind of teach, for better or for worse, some of those nuances by having those rules in there. And then the difficulty in it is the approachability then of using these things. But just to shift over to like another aspect of the gear, the most interesting and least appreciated to some degree or another is the non-combat gear.
Yeah.
Because these are the abstract problem-solving things that are necessary to do the job. You know, like we were talking about before, like, oh yeah, I've got like an unreal level of lockpick skill. Okay, do you have lockpicks? Well, if you didn't bring your lockpicks, I can't logically see how you would do that. It's not like you're going to stick your finger in there and
Exactly.
somehow we're, because it's impractical. That doesn't mean you need a traditional set of lockpicks. You might be able to find a way to improvise it, and that's true of any other skill.
You use a bobby pin.
Yeah, exactly. I would think that wouldn't give you the advantage. I don't know that it would give you a penalty. It really depends on understanding. I think
Disadvantage die.
I understand lockpicking enough to say that if you had at least the basics, you could do it without any bonus. And then if you had specially made lockpicks, that would give you a bonus. I guess if you were using like really like, oh, I've only got this really sort of pliable piece of wire and like a small metal bar or shaft, and it's not, I guess that would be a penalty.
Mm-hmm.
But there's other things like rope. So like, aside from going up and down things and climbing the wall of a castle or into some kind of dungeon pit, there's all kinds of things you can use rope for. You can you can tie people together. You can keep yourself from being blown away. This is the thing about non-combat equipment, is that that's where the imagination really kicks in. And I guess there's a reasonable debate about whether did you bring that with you?
Oh yeah, see, that's interesting.
But for me, the fun is deciding to bring those things with me and to go ahead and be like, because if I go out to, if I'm doing errands around town, or, trying to do things, I think about all the things I would need to do that. Right. I don't just like, we're going off into the mountain to slay the dragon. Well, I'm fine just the way I am. That's how I'm getting there. And I'm like, who thinks that way? Well, I think it has to do with like cinematic interpretations of those things. It's like, oh, well, of course we brought rope.
You can do the Blades in the Dark style where you're like, you get to the thing and you're like, do we have a lockpick kit? And you're like, yeah, because I flash back to me having it, so you can like do lots of clever maneuvering around this.
So I like that because it takes account, and there's a consequence for it. You do end up paying something for not being prepared, but you're never caught you're never caught completely naked in that situation.
But the idea that you have an adventurer's backpack, just like intrinsically a part of your human form or dwarf form or whatever, that you can like pull a 10-foot pole out of, to like, that's stupid.
Yeah.
I do agree. You need to have, in some more survival-y contexts, you need to have this notion that you're going to be bringing stuff to solve problems that your hands can't.
Yeah. Like, if you're like in a spy adventure and you're going to like swim into like the submarine dock, well, you'd probably be better off not knowing how far that actually is. Probably good to bring scuba equipment.
Yeah.
Like it's those sorts of things where, no, I like the fun of having to think of the thing that I need. And as a GM, I don't mind prompting people. Like I'm not somebody that doesn't give hints every once in a while. I think the best way to do this is through another character.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I understand. So instead of you like breaking the wall, you just have a character in the world bring up what's appropriate.
Yeah, or you preemptively put them in that situation. So like to use like the 007 spy situation. After getting your mission from M, you're then sent to Q.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like as a matter of course. And then Q gives you all of your stuff. And then that'll get you thinking, well, maybe I need some other stuff that is beyond the novel gadgets that have been determined to be useful by the GM.
That's one of my favorite things to play with Jay, or one of my favorite reasons to play with Jay, I should say, is his attention to shopping, and not in like just getting a new hat, even though that's still fun. It's so much more about like, what provisions are we going to need on this journey? What is it that we're going to take with us? We're going to use to solve problems, and we're going to need to stay alive. And that's actually fun to have somebody in your party ground you in that, if you can lose that. Like sometimes I'll just get caught in the narrative and forget that there's consequences to some of the more mundane aspects of the story.
Jay's best character in any game that I've run was when he played a mercenary that took the business side of it very seriously.
Yes, that's great.
And he was basically a fighter with bartering abilities like you wouldn't believe. And it fit his play style because he likes to be meticulous about what they'll need and think about ahead and ask questions about like, oh, like what's the terrain like? Let me ask somebody about that. Like, oh, we should probably pack some rope, or, trying to figure out like how many rations do we need to get from here to there, and we should get into that. But yeah, I think like aside, like equipment tends to apply either it's this really cool, like intuitive or common sense acting tool that then solves a problem. The other thing that it usually works as is some kind of bonus. So as I was saying, like you could probably get away with picking a lock with a paper clip and a firm, like a popsicle stick's probably too thick, but something to turn the mechanism while you run the tumblers. But like it could be things like a scope on a sniper rifle. It might not necessarily increase the range, but it would improve your accuracy over that range. So yeah, numerical bonuses are definitely a thing that's part of the package.
Yeah,
and I like those sorts of things. And I guess that kind of ties into things like the quality and durability aspect that we mentioned earlier. Is like, well, like this gun shoots, but does it shoot as good as like I found this gun in the mud and it had been like rusted over, and yeah, even after cleaning it, I'm not sure it's 100%.
Right.
And some of the crafting skills can come into like, yeah, am I good enough to bring it back to where it's at least baseline? Before we move on to consumables, I'm curious to pick your brain about the idea of trade goods.
This is one of those things that I kind of was saying earlier, right, about like crafting, where having a lot of little things in your inventory works great in a computer game and terrible in an RPG. And it's like, that's my issue with trade goods is I love trade routes. I don't really like trade goods. Like I want to connect places and I want to profit off of that connection in like a trader man way. You know what I mean? Like there are cool things I want to do there, but I don't really want to bring like 300 watermelons across the river and try and sell them to make extra gold and then buy 300 fish to move to the next town to sell that. Like I'd rather do something that's more abstract and broad strokes in a sense.
Okay. See, I agree with you in a general sense, except under one caveat, which is if the merchant caravan is the game.
Oh, okay.
Because now you've changed the scope of play. And now a great example of this is doing a merchant campaign in like Dark Sun.
That's a whole fun ride.
Now it's kind of make your own fun, but like the bartering and the acquiring of the materials and the mischief that you can get up to through that is now the focal point. So now I think it is worth selling, like bringing, 500 watermelons to a location, because now we can play off the idea, well, what happens to the watermelons? How durable are they? How much will I get from them if I get to the other place? It's a different kind of game. You're playing more of like a market economy role-playing game.
It's true, yeah.
But again, this is the whole idea about focus. You really got to ask yourself, and this is, I think, is just a general takeaway for like anything. What is your game about? Like when you make a campaign, are you space merchants or space pirates?
Well, that's kind of the Traveler question, right? Or the Stars Without Number question, or whatever game you're wanting to settle your eyes on, right?
And that doesn't mean you can't pivot later from one into the other. But in the right context, that minutia of getting and bartering for goods and bringing them to another place to sell is the fun.
Yeah. Well, I would really say the key takeaway for me with a trading good is like, it's about the travel,
Oh, I agree.
Less than like the bolts and nuts or whatever that I'm bringing.
The cargo.
Sure. Yeah. But like being able to make those cool journeys. And that's why I felt like a trade route to me was like what I wanted out of it, because I want to emphasize that journey, less the goods themselves. But if you don't have the goods, you don't have the journey to begin with. So it's true. You do need to have that trackable, tangible element that helps make the world feel more real.
Sure. And like different goods can have different qualities in the sense that, like, some of them expire. Some of them might be more needed than others in a certain situation. Some might be illegal.
That's true, yeah, contraband style.
I don't think there needs to be a ton of detail in trade goods so much as the dramatic consequences that might come from it. I don't want to just be carrying boxes of generic cargo. But I agree, like, you don't have to get like down to like counting every bean in the crate. But I do think that notable qualities of that thing, which are, if anything, more tied to what you would call the mission structure of it, I think are important, right? Because then what's the risk? You know, if I'm carrying cargo that has a high, like if I'm carrying bars of gold, there's now a higher risk of me getting jumped.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. So I personally think that a certain level of those details actually matter a lot. You know, just having the route, and again, it's all about what you use at any one time.
Yeah.
What we're carrying happens before the journey happens.
Right.
So you're not having to think about where I'm, you know, like, oh, do I get grain or do I get, you know, machine parts? That occupies its own little place in play. Then when you get to the part where we're actually traveling, then it's all about the journey.
Yes. And that's where I get the most like juice out of the experience. But I know what you mean, like having those components, like the more stuff that feeds off of stuff, so to speak, the more domino bricks that are hitting each other, the more rewarding it's all going to feel.
Let me sell it to you like this. It's not necessarily about all of the stuff. It's more about that generic crate having a label on the crate.
Yeah.
Right? It's not necessarily the contents of that. It's still just a crate I have to move, but there's a special label that ties it to something that could have certain factors or ramifications in certain situations.
That's a good point.
So it's not just a crate, it's a crate of weapons, right? There's a huge difference there.
Crate of watermelons, again.
Low stakes travel.
But before we do conclude, I do want to make sure we hit the consumables and just talk about how they can both apply as a role-playing mechanic, as a provision that you need, that doesn't really have a mechanical, like, you didn't eat this many calories today? Well, I'm sorry. Like, nothing quite so crazy as that. But like in 5e, you can just apply the exhausted condition, right?
Right, yeah.
So it's, if you haven't done enough sort of immersive upkeep of your characters in a sort of a grounded capacity without needing full survival mechanics, you can just apply a modifier to them, you know, or some type of mild penalty. Or you could go the other route where you have like dedicated survival mechanics, which may be, you know, something more like travel oriented, or they could be very specific to like health and food consumption and things.
Yeah, like it depends on the theme of your game and the focal point of what the play is. So if it's all about, say you're playing L5R and it's all about politics and battles and duels and stuff like that, I think you can handwave a lot of the survival consumables except in those situations where the condition of that normality is changed.
I agree.
So like you're attacked by bandits and then you have to wander your way out, you know, and your retinue and transportation are destroyed and now you're in the woods.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's, as I said, that's those pockets, right? I don't bring these rules or these considerations into it unless you're in a situation that calls for that. Now, but if you're playing a actual survival game, you know, you're playing, what are some good, so Dungeons and Dragons is like classic old Dungeons and Dragons is a survival game about raiding dungeons, and it's about the amount of light food ammunition that you bring in there, and playing it a certain way, that is the fun. You can also not play it that way, and it can still be fun, but there's a different tension there.
Yeah.
And you could be way more hardcore survival, like playing like Twilight 2000.
Yeah.
Or something that's got more grittiness. I would say that there are a few games that don't explicitly have that, but certainly suit it. But then there's the concern is like, how do you manage that? And when we were talking about it, I think I broke it into what I consider I have two categories that I tend to bring these rulings into, which is situational versus accountable. I'll explain accountable, and then Troy, maybe you can explain situational.
Okay, absolutely.
So accountable's pretty easy. I'm counting every bullet, every arrow, every ration denoted on how many days it might last. I think it depends on the time scale that you're measuring things like travel, water consumed. Now, the number of those things is based on what you feel comfortable handling and what suits your game. So if I'm playing Dark Sun, water is going to matter a lot. And then food, and then ammunition. Could handwave that. Probably makes sense to keep it. The approach is I'm marking every unit of that, and what a unit is can vary.
And if you want to contrast that to situational, that is when you don't track the specific consumption of your consumables, but instead, in certain contexts, you will check your supply. So my favorite example is in Necromunda, the 2018 edition, when you are firing and you're rolling your auto dice or whatever we call it, and you roll the ammo check, you then will have to take a look at your weapon's ammo rarity and roll on that. Roll a d6, and on a last weapon, it's like 2 or higher. And if you roll under that, then you're out of ammo. That weapon is now null for the rest of the fight. But if you roll above that, you've now reloaded. And that, to me, is a really cool way to have the tension of running out of ammo without you having to specifically count and track and manage it.
It's Schrodinger's magazine, basically.
Yeah, it is.
Like it's empty when the result comes up that I'm out of bullets. And I think both of those work well. I think what I worked out is that it's a little bit more, it depends on what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, and this was the best way that I was able to describe it. In a game like Necromunda, or the Alien role-playing game also has a similar mechanic where if you roll a critical miss, your gun is out of ammo. And then that requires you to take a reload action. In that case, where not everybody is like pulling their magazine out and checking to see how many rounds they have, and it's a fierce firefight. It's meant to feel dramatic. Those mechanics work super well. But if I'm playing BattleTech and I know that I have a screen in the cockpit that says exactly how many rounds are in that, I'm counting the rounds. Because that's more immersive in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. You have like a heads-up display to tell you this, where in the Underdark of Necromunda, you don't really know how many stub rounds you have left in your stub gun. You just kind of know you got some.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that about wraps it up for us. But that's like, is there any last points you want to make?
There's a lot of ways to do equipment, and I think the most fun way to do it, depends on everyone's table, but I think it is making equipment more than just some like flat bonus. Exactly, right? Make it something that you interact with, that's tangible, that you can get, that you can lose. It doesn't have to be a magic item to be significant or special. Like just a different looking sword can mean something different.
Yeah. Actually, one last point that I'll put in there that I think is my favorite remedy of these are keywords.
Oh, yeah.
They're effectively talents or feats, but for weapons. And they give them properties that make them more than just a list of numbers. And there's a few games that do those. Wolfrep 4 is probably the one that's jumping to mind. Or Maledictum does that too.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's a number of war games that also have that for units, where
100%.
There's a series of keywords after their basic numbers or stats. So you have damage and you've got range and all these other things, and then it's like balanced or
torrent, whatever,
piercing,
right? Yeah,
or,
we're talking about 10th edition. We're talking about so many games that incorporate this kind of like word coding verbs system, to try and like tell you when you use this, it works like this.
Yeah, exactly. So that in my opinion, that's my favorite way of handling that.
That's smart. Yeah, I got to agree with the keywords. I think the keywords are better than just trying to rely exclusively on numeric differences between all these many and varied items.
Mm-hmm.
I think keywords can add a narrative, descriptive modifier and distinction that makes them important and separate.
Yeah, exactly. So, final thoughts: don't undersell equipment.
Yeah,
buy it at a premium price.
Exactly. Buy now.
Yeah, buy now.
We'll be back next week. We're going to be covering a very popular, very thematically fulfilling board game, War of the Ring by Ares Games. So we'll be getting in on that. It's a personal favorite of mine, so I look forward to talking about that in some detail. So please be ready to tune in the next week for that. And if you have any thoughts on weapons, armor, and equipment yourself, throw it in the comments, give us some perspectives, and we'll be happy to chat back.
Yeah. Happy gaming.
Happy gaming.
We hope you enjoyed delving into today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on all popular podcast platforms. Join us again on the next exciting episode of Tales and Tactics.